Well, welcome everyone. Another fantastic masterclass from the Design for Good Royal College of Art Academy. Another exciting moment to meet up with Terry Behan. And Terry and I are going to be in conversation. But before that, let me say a few words about Terry. Terry is the Chief Design Officer for Nedbank, has been a leading absolute thought leader in the world of design, and especially thinking through the practicalities of real implementation, where as designers, we need to make sure that we can understand business model innovation as well as we can understand service and solution innovation. Coming up with a fantastic proposition that is going to mean that you have a social and environmentally sustainable solution, but without thinking about how the business model can also be sustainable, is going to be just a kind of waste of time because it'll be a fantastic proposition maybe, but it won't get implemented. And if you're an NGO, you're a development organization, and you're thinking about how am I going to implement it, then again, understanding what the business model is and seeing the business model actually as that point of differentiation is absolutely crucial. So Terry is someone who's explored this topic in great depth. So I'm going to pass over now to Terry and ask Terry to share with us some of his reflections on it. Then we'll have a conversation. But whilst we have that conversation, I'm expecting this fantastic audience to be coming up with your questions, your reflections, your observations. If it's not a question, that's okay. Put it into the Q&A or put it into the chat bar. We don't mind which way you do it. But what we want to do is make sure that we make this as interactive as possible and make it a masterclass that will truly be not only memorable, certainly unforgettable, because that's the very nature of what a class should be, but also one that propels your thinking and gives you quite fresh perspectives and new capacity to be able to really explore the business model side and be as excited about that as developing that wonderful customer experience and user experience that I know you all have. So, Terry, I'm going to pass it over to you to tell us a little bit more about what you're up to today and then your views on this very exciting and important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for that great introduction and welcome to everybody. And really thank you for joining online from RCA, from Design for Good, and for all of our partners across the world. So this topic around business model design is just it's grown in importance in the last couple of decades, largely because building things has become incredibly easy. So the ability to be able to kind of conceptualize a product, bring that to life, take it into production, and to ship it, whether that's a solution that we're looking at in the commercial space, in the digital space, or I think as the point of discussion today is we're looking at solutions, through a social lens or a social impact lens. The ability to sort of spin things up and get them out into the world has certainly improved dramatically. So that's created a scenario where there is an excess of product in the market. And one of the things that has come up is I think as you articulated, is how do you differentiate against the competition, and how do you differentiate through the lens of a business model? And a business model is nothing other than the vehicle that takes your product to market. But in many cases, many designers and certainly many organizations don't consider that they have optionality with that is concerned. And they often default to the assumption that the products and services and solutions they shipped in the past have to be shipped out to market in the same way. So in the way that we get our design hats on and we think about different ways to solve a problem, it's also, I think, important to think about different ways then to sort of package that and to take it to market in the context of a business model. So what I'll do is I've put some stuff together on Keynote. I'll share it. And then what we'll do is we'll just kind of walk through a little bit of some examples, some samples of different types of business models, just to kind of warm the conversation up. And I'm looking forward to talking with everybody. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just pitch and play our slideshow. Okay, so you should all be seeing a beautiful big blue neon sign that says hello, and obviously a bit of a focus on the topic. And I think one of the key disclaimers that we often want to make when we're talking about anything related to design at the moment is because the technology is moving so fast and the sort of the different parameters around which a product or service comes into being is evolving. And it's really important to say that our job is not to have the answers necessarily. It's just to keep a few sharp pencils, and it's to help ourselves and our partners just get closer to the target. So we kind of narrow the window a little bit, and we're much more likely to be successful. I think the challenge is we said it's really easy to build things in the 21st century. And what's that resulted is arguably saying that the world is awash with a lot of product we could probably do without. So it's superfluous. So bringing a solution into market relatively easy, but bringing a good product or service into market is becoming increasingly more difficult because you got to break through the clutter. It's quite likely that whatever you're producing has either got direct, indirect, or substitute competitors. So how do we think about sort of differentiating the product in a sustainable way? And sustainable may refer to sustainability in the environmental context, but I think more importantly and more frequently, it's referring to it in an economic context. So how do we make something economically sustainable? How do you make sure that it can stay the course? And this is where this idea of business model innovation comes in. And where business models have sort of evolved quite, I mean, they've been around for a long time. We'll share some examples of those, but it's really come into a focus because this idea of being able to think through the business model that takes the product to market, experiment with it, and prototype it as frequently and as often as one would prototype the actual product itself is quite important. So maybe let's just maybe talk a few examples. We'll skip that for now. So one of the key ones that one of the early kind of innovators in business model design, arguably McDonald's. So we would very few of us would remember, maybe our parents would remember back in the day when McDonald's kind of came into being. It was a small organization making hamburgers, 15-cent hamburgers, and was a very unprofitable organization. One of the, if you ever get a chance, there's a phenomenal movie called The Founder. So The Founder is about Ray Kroc and the McDonald's team and how they grew it from a kind of very small, I think, three franchises at a particular moment in time to this kind of global behemoth that it was. But it was the turning point in the movie. And one of the turning points is where the founder, Ray Kroc, although he arguably wasn't the founder, realized that you can't make 3 cents cut on a 15 cents hamburger and grow an empire. And he sat down with a guy called Harry Sonnenborn, and together they worked out a plan that said, actually, the burger remains the product, but the vehicle that takes the product to market is the acquisition of land. And as you acquire land, you can acquire more land. And as you acquire more land, your balance sheet grows. And as your balance sheet grows, you can expand. So McDonald's global expansion is not as a consequence of the quality of their product. It's a consequence of the business model that supported that product going to market. Consequently, some of the big ones like Disney, what's the product for Disney? Well, arguably, it's you go to Disney, so Disney World specifically, you go on the rides, and you have a hot dog, and it's joy, and it's all that sort of phenomenal experience that we maybe all get to do once in our life. But that's not the business model. The business model is as an expert in the field who helps these type of parks get off the ground, said to me, he said, Terry, Disney World is a giant canteen with a couple of rides tacked on the side. I was like, what do you mean? He said, the business model is not the rides. The business model is the value that they capture when they get you into the park, that you're paying, $15 for a $2 hamburger, or $18 for a $5 shake, or $20 for a stuffed toy that was probably made for 50 cents. That's the business model. It's the capture of value while they have you in the park. And their job through the rides is to keep you there for as long as possible, to engage you as deeply as possible, to get you to spend as much as possible. So, okay. So, and again, one of the reasons that they're so big and so sustainable. I think one of my favorite ones is Peloton. So Peloton make exercise bikes. They've been making exercise bikes since about 2012. But they had a really deep insight. They said, you know what, it's a bit lonely getting on a spinning bike by yourself at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning and off we go. And in fact, the world is to a certain extent awash with spinning bikes sitting in the bedroom, gathering dust. And what they did was their insight was it's much more fun to do it with others, but to do it from the comfort of your home. So you got to imagine the prototype for this. It was a bike, a roll of duct tape, and an iPad. and they would have duct taped the iPad onto the handlebars and then connected with 50 or 60 of their closest friends, and now they're in the content business. And they've been able to scale the most extraordinary business from away from it just being a physical product to it being the business model, which is the content platform that takes their vehicle to market. And they grew phenomenally, obviously, over the period of COVID, but and subsequently beyond that. But again, it's sort of thinking about not just the innovation within the product and the improvements within the product, it's thinking about the business model that sits parallel to that that takes it to market. So this is kind of some of the thinking that we see out there, and some of the success stories in business model innovation. I think one I discovered as a consequence of my teenage daughters a couple of years ago was Sol de Janeiro, and this phenomenal success within their product range. This is one of the more popular ones called Bum Bum Cream. But this idea of promoting Brazilian beauty. So are they the first, and will they be the last cosmetics company to promote beauty or fashion from a certain part of the world? Absolutely not. But their business model was very much one of social proofing, but also drop shipping on social. So what they did is a very early stage in their career, and in their life cycle, they understood they had a really good product, and they had what we would typically call in the market product market fit, but they needed to evolve their business model, and they really zoned in on empowering creators and empowering social influencers to sell the product on their behalf, otherwise known as drop shipping. And they've been considered one of the great success stories of the last decade in that area. I think, like I said to you at the beginning, this is a practice that's been around since the dawn of time. And I think one of the original business model innovations that I observed, I think quite humorously so, was in Egypt. If you've ever been to the pyramids, have you ever seen camels? They're ginormously tall. They're like 12 foot tall, but they're all sitting down on the ground. And you get the sort of the camel owner, he's saying to all the tourists, come, it's for free, get on the camel. And some people wise up to what's about to happen, but as you see in the picture, these guys didn't. And they jump on top of the camel, and it gets up, and the camel's pretty tall. You can't get down. And they walk around for 10, 20 minutes, and the tourist will say, okay, I want to come down now. And then the camel herder goes, $50. And then it's a negotiation, usually entering $10 or $12. So it's a freemium to premium model that they kind of mastered way before digital ever existed. There's also, I think, consequently the opposite, and we have to talk about this because I think many businesses are also resistant to innovation. So this is what we call business model exovation, which is the opposite of innovation. And this sort of idea of being resistant to innovation, I think, is quite important, because as we understand, we are very encouraging of companies wanting to push forward and innovate and change their product and evolve their business model. And in many cases, some organizations have a fantastic product, but the business model in it did not innovate to support that product. And I say this with a heavy heart. Nick, you'll relate to this like me. But back in the day, if you grew up in the sort of 80s and the 90s, MTV was where it's at. MTV for us was, Instagram meets Netflix meets Spotify all rolled into one. It's where you went to understand what the social trends of the day were, or it was all the great music was packaged into this platform, and it was indestructible. It was massive. It grew its business not just in the music context, in the cataloging side, but in events, in TV production, and it closed down on the 31st of December 2025 and shut its doors because it did not evolve its business model, even though it had arguably all of the levers and all of the legs to be able to dominate in the content world, but it didn't, because the product remained the same, but the business model didn't innovate. Equally so, Nokia. There's that very famous quote and speech from the chief executive of Nokia just before they folded. I mean, at one point, Nokia represented 60% of the value of the Finnish stock exchange. I mean, they dominated the cell phone industry the world over. They made and continued to make up until the time that they essentially merged into Sony Ericsson and diluted and ultimately disappeared. They made the most extraordinary phones. They were indestructible, but the business model did not innovate. While BlackBerry was looking at sort of BBM, and while Apple was evolving its sort of app ecosystem, Nokia were just making great phones. And they said when they shut down and when they went to that point of dilution, they were saying, well, we still don't know what we did wrong. And the answer was they didn't do anything wrong on the product side, but they did not evolve their business model to keep up with the changes in the market. One of my favorite rappers, the legendary J. Cole, has this wonderful lyric in one of his songs. He says, "The good news is we've come a long way. The bad news is we're going the wrong way." And that also applies to a lot of products in the market, where the good news is we've come a long way. Look, we're shipping a product to market. We're out there, we're delivering, we're doing well. But the bad news is we're going the wrong way. We're not thinking about the business model in an appropriate way. And maybe the target is, and the market's over there, but we're kind of taking it over there. So, and there's some really good examples of that. One of the great ones is a really good innovation, which is MoviePass. So MoviePass was again a play on this idea of a product as a service model, where you would get a gym membership and you would pay a certain amount for that every month. But then the company selling those gym memberships were relying on you not to come because they couldn't accommodate all of their members if they came at the same time. And MoviePass tried to tap into that, but unfortunately it didn't work because what they misunderstood or how they misread the market was when people say they want a movie pass and they want to, get an all access pass for $9.99 a month, there's a good chance they want to actually go to the movies. And their business model crashed and burned because they were oversubscribed in terms of the number of people subscribing to MoviePass and actually using MoviePass in the theaters was far in excess of what they had hoped would actually happen. So doomed by their own success. Similarly, SoundCloud, to a certain extent, a precursor to Spotify and Apple Music, an incredibly good platform that was there to curate extraordinary music, but couldn't crack the business model side of it. And then sort of, it has a second wind. It's got a new chief executive in place since 2023, but certainly an institution that did not kind of evolve on the business model side and consequently, didn't necessarily scale the way it could have. So maybe just to think about it in this kind of way. There are sort of five models or five levers, for want of a better term, for business model growth. The first thing is have a strong value proposition. So make sure that the actual product that your has social value. It's designed to sort of address sort of societal needs. It's solving a genuine problem. So that's something we would know as designers quite well. But these other models or these other levers or rules are important as it pertains to business model design. You have to have revenue loops. We have to think about revenue beyond the obvious context of a sale. We have to seek out cultural stickiness. If a product or service in this era is not culturally sticky, it fades from existence. We have to build what we call adaptive scalability, which means essentially one particular type of business model may get us to a certain point, but we may need to evolve that business model through the life cycle of the product as we would the product itself. And the last one is this idea of building scalable ecosystems. It mostly applies to digital products. So scalable ecosystems kind of occur where network effects kick in and you can play with this idea of near zero marginal cost. So the cost of the next item or next product or next sale, trends towards zero. The larger you get, the cheaper it is. So typically digital kind of solves for that. But I think it's also equally applicable in other categories. And maybe just to kind of close it out, just to maybe sort of tighten it up with a few of the different types of business models, because you'd be saying, Terry, okay, you're talking about business models, but like what are the actual types? And if we were to kind of try and codify it, I've kind of looked at six: subscription model, products as a service, this idea of freemium, micro franchise, cooperative ownership, product on demand, and they all do slightly different things. And one of the key things I often say to teams, so I do about 50 to 60 syndicate teams a year where we talk about business model innovation in parallel to the product development. And what I often say to them is, it doesn't have to be any of these. You can invent your own. It just has to work and it has to test well and it has to help you find scale and market. So subscription will be typically an easy one where we all have, we all, I can guarantee us on this call right now are subscribed to different subscription-based models. So I use the Virgin example because it's common across a lot of countries where you pay a subscription model to go to the gym. But also it can be used in interesting areas, and this is one you'll see called YouCook. YouCook. I live in. I probably should have said I'm dialing in from my home in Cape Town this evening. YouCook was a South African phenomenon where they had a very simple insight that said, people want home cooked meals. They want good quality food at home. There's nothing new about that insight. and they competed with dozens of other companies providing the same service. But their model was a subscription model. They said, we want you to subscribe to a minimum, a set number of meals every month. We'll ship them to you and logistically get them out to you next day. They're freeze dried, so you can put them in the freezer, and you just take one out in the morning and defrost it, cook it against those instructions, take a photograph, share it on Instagram, and hey presto, you're Gordon Ramsay. So that model worked really well. So it was again a commodity which was competing in the food and FMCG, or certainly the food and beverage industry, but they differentiated radically away from their peers by creating a subscription model that sat on top of the actual product itself. They scaled this onto Unilever, and they did exceptionally well. Product as service is where the consumer pays for the service the product provides, but doesn't actually have the responsibility of owning it. So when we talk about this, we talk about the great examples, Rolls-Royce, the engines, not the car. So most airlines will work with Rolls-Royce and have Rolls-Royce engines. You will never own a Rolls-Royce engine on an airplane. You can only lease it or from Rolls-Royce, because they provide you not 92% or 95%, 100% guaranteed uptime. So that product as a service is a value add to the industry, not just to the airline. Hilti is a classic example of a company that still does both, but Hilti had a very simple insight that said, well, we know our partners and our customers, who are typically foremen on building sites, don't really care about our product. They just want holes in the wall so they can, they can pop steel rivets into them. And what Hilti did was they pivoted away from selling their equipment to building contractors to then providing it as a product as a service. And their business model allowed them to grow between 30 to 50% across different markets by utilizing this model. Because what they guaranteed was, they said, look, on a building site, you want uptime. If this piece of equipment goes down, it slows down the whole build cycle. We'll guarantee you a 24-hour turnaround time in terms of swapping out the equipment. And that worked really well. Go Solar is one of my favorites. It operates in the markets where I'm based in Southern Africa. We have we've had, as many countries do, a fuel, or literally an energy crisis, where we're not able to produce enough energy to supply the market. So rooftop solar became really popular. And while many companies went out and sold rooftop solar solutions to the market, Go Solar said, no, we're not going to sell it to you. We're going to provide you that as a service. We'll install it for you, we'll maintain it for you, we'll look after it for you, and you'll pay us a monthly fee. And again, they're one of the only ones that are in place today that are still successful. The freemium model, we're all familiar with it, whether it's the getting up on a camel at the pyramids, or whether it's Spotify's model of moving you from a freemium to a premium model with built-in friction. So great freemium product, but they will build in enough friction that they know roughly 12% of all freemium subscribers will eventually shift to premium over time. And it's worked incredibly well for them. YouTube Premium almost does the opposite. And if you haven't seen it, it's a phenomenal product. YouTube Premium is YouTube's business model is on ad sales. So YouTube doesn't want you to necessarily go YouTube Premium, because it makes money from everybody who consumes the product on ad sales. But there is a percentage of their market that doesn't want that. So their model is to sort of shift those people that don't want ads into a premium model, and they provide you a much bigger catalog of music and movies and a wide range of different things. Micro franchise is very much an emerging market phenomenon, where very, very simply put, we all want what we want, but we can't necessarily afford it, and 80% of the world's population live in emerging economies. So we maybe think about like a 5 kg bag of washing detergent being what we would purchase in a Western context. But purchasing a 5 kg bag of washing detergent in an emerging economy, if I'm living in an informal settlement, is not wise, because that product will spoil over time. What do I want? 5, 20, 50 grams. I can buy that on a day-to-day basis. I can go out there and I can trade and purchase small quantities of that product on an ongoing basis. And interestingly, the profit margins within micro franchising and micro packaging are much bigger, because smaller quantities typically determine larger values. It's a really successful, scalable model in emerging economies. Cooperative ownership, one of my favorites, which is typically John Deere does this really well, which are the big kind of co-op companies that sell the tractors. and they bring farmers together because no one farmer can afford all that equipment, and then they come together in a co-op and they bunch together to buy the equipment. I've seen this model used quite successfully in water as well, where water reticulation is really expensive, or building a reservoir is too big a cost for any one partner to bear, so they come together to do that. And then one of the great designers, Olafur Eliasson, designed the Little Sun, which is a slightly different approach to cooperative ownership. But he designed this beautiful, robust solar light that's designed to, it's almost like an arbitrage model, but it's designed to be consumed by kids. His target audience was dominantly in Rwanda and in Uganda, and to a certain extent Central Africa. And you were able to purchase that either for free or at a really low cost, because he was also selling it to kids in Northern Europe. And those kids were buying it at a cost plus level, but understanding and doing that a child in an emerging economy in Central Africa was benefiting from that product as well. And then value arbitrage, which is I think the way a lot of young people, certainly this is how a lot of digital nomads make money, which is essentially saying, look, I'll take a product that's a freemium product, or a product where I'm licensing it. Like my go-tos at the moment are are Gemini and Claude. And what I do is I certainly teach my teenagers to work with those products and to sell those services on to third parties, in a markup context. And that sort of value arbitrage has become a massive industry, and a very important growth industry for young children who are potentially or young adults who are potentially unemployed, but can use their wisdom and their skill to sort of use those products to sell on services elsewhere. So maybe let me just kind of slow this one down and close it out, and saying my wish for us all, as we get into the next cohort for Design for Good, and to all my colleagues at RCA, and to the students there, is that we do, as they say in Accra, Ghana, at the Chateau Wale Festival, do some epic shit.
Terry, just making sure I've unmuted myself, so hopefully you can hear me still. But
And indeed.
thank you so much indeed for sharing those thoughts with us all. You really focused in on the fact that as designers, we're always focused on what's the value proposition that we create for the people that we're trying to serve. And by trying to serve, we tend to focus so much on on the users as part of it. But you broaden that to kind of say, look, let's focus on all the different stakeholders, and the value proposition will look different to each of those. But we must also not just think about value creation, which we're just so good at doing as designers. We've got to think about value capture, which means having empathy with the people who are pushing their current business model, and helping them see that they need to imagine perhaps another one as part of it. And and some of you will be sitting out there thinking, what does a business model mean? Well, it just is, how do I create value for my customer?
Mm.
And then how do I capture that value for their business so that we can keep on creating value for the customer? And how can we capture a little bit more so that we can keep growing and scaling what we do? And I think your 6 models about does that value flow back into the organization is absolutely superb. So, for all those who are part of the academy, we'll be sharing those with them. Others, I'm sure, watch this all over again. We're recording it as part of it. A question which I suppose is in all of our minds really is, as designers, we don't go to business school. In fact, well, perhaps some of us have been to business school. And there are lots of people with an MBA who have lots of ideas about what a service should be. But we recognize that the experience that we deliver includes the commercial or monetary element about how value is going to be recycled back in. What are the challenges, do you think, and what are the approaches that designers can take to help them feel more confident about developing that business model, proposing it? I mean, it's clear there would be no Uber without a business model. Would Hertz have come up with Uber? I don't think so. Would Marriott Hotels or Bonvoy come up with uh, Airbnb. Almost certainly not. But it's the designer who needs to be able to push that and think in those terms. What do you think are the best ways? Not necessarily the barriers, but what kind of tips and techniques do you think we
Sure.
can share with people on this?
I mean, I think a recognition to begin with that as a trained designer, you innately have the skill to do this. So that's important, is it's not some mystical skill set that gets just developed by a few people. So I think, but we got to go beyond. So designers for me are inherently curious. And I would encourage that curiosity to extend into a couple of other disciplines. So a working knowledge of economics, I think, is important, Nick. I think,
Yeah,
and a working knowledge of psychology. If I could say, design's often one of those weird subjects to a certain extent that borders the humanities and the sciences. Depending on which college you went to, you might end up with an MPhil in design or an MSc in design. It's not regulated in that regard. I think that's wonderful because then it can evolve as a discipline. It's not static. So for me, it's like this idea of really understanding the fundamentals of economics, the fundamentals of digital economics. So if I'm building like certain products and services, do they get more expensive if I build more, or do they get cheaper? And also human psychology, and how do people react to certain things. I mean, one of the earlier examples I showed on YouCook when we were talking about a product as a service approach, sorry, a subscription approach, was they really understood that people are busy, and it's interesting is MBA students are one of their biggest segments. And the insight was, and I was teaching an MBA class a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to the students, and there was one lady, and she was in her 30s. She's got three kids already. She's doing her MBA. She gets home in the evening. She pulls out a U cook. She puts it in the oven. She takes it out, and then she snaps a photograph, posts it on Instagram, and basically communicating to the world, yes, I'm busy, but I still have time to make magnificent food at home for my family. So social proofing was a psychological insight that you could leaned on really heavily to support their business model.
yeah.
So it's really kind of like understanding that the opportunity set for designers is expanding rapidly, and understanding that if we just kind of like continue that level of curiosity beyond the obvious and into the world of economics and into the world of psychology, I think, and business strategy to a certain extent, I think combining those things together really creates for an extraordinary set of opportunities.
Thanks so much for that. And another thought that I was reflecting on as well, when you were talking about prototyping the business model, we tend to prototype the service or the product. We tend to prototype and are very comfortable with prototyping what that experience might be, bringing different people in, seeing if what we thought the experience would be, and if the value we thought we would create is also the value that the customer really derives from that. But prototyping the business model in terms of capture is different as well. And I just wondered if you have some reflections about how to go about prototyping, how to go about checking with the users, the organizations, and different stakeholders that the value proposition actually does add up for them, and that the way you're thinking of creating and capturing the value is going to be viable and is going to be attractive for them. And I just wondered if you've had some further reflections on that too.
I mean, in many ways, we often run into this idea that sometimes prototyping can be really expensive when you've got to go build a product or build a high fidelity version of the product to test it. I think one of the great things in the business model design world is that the opposite is true. It's not expensive to prototype a business model, because what you're essentially doing is you're taking the product as it exists or as you want it to be, and you're communicating to your customers the different ways they can then consume that value. And almost like at the most simplistic level, if you can imagine taking any particular product and just card sorting it in terms of, is it a freemium model? Is it a product as a service? Or what are the other options that we come up with?
Yeah,
And having that discussion with customers, it costs absolutely nothing.
yeah,
And that for me is an easy way. One of the things I've been experimenting with a little bit and getting into a lot more is synthetic testing, where I'm able to build out fairly large persona-based models populated with economic data and then I ask that LLM a series of synthetic questions, and it proxies for the user, as a way of sort of in a sort of laboratory environment experimenting with that's concerned. I think the great thing about business model prototyping is in many cases it's just conversations with customers. So hey, if I gave this to you for, as a service, and you didn't buy it from me anymore, would you be willing to sort of sign a lease agreement with me for 2 years, and I'll guarantee you uptime, and I'll guarantee you that the product goes down, I'll replace it in 24 hours. So it's a lot easier, I think, than the actual product side. It just requires some good research and some good testing.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely with that approach, and it makes me think about a project that turned into a very successful business that came out of the RCA, which was in-house records. And the challenge was from the Ministry of Justice: can you find a way of reducing the number of prisoners who offend so they don't come back in, because the reoffending rates were so high? Unfortunately, they said, we're not sure if there's any money that we can come up with to support it, but come up with some ideas. So they did come up with ideas. And one of the ideas was to create a record label inside the prisons that would be really attractive to the prisoners to sign up to. A record label where they could be part of the marketing, the distribution, they could be part of the performance, they could be doing the A&R role, they could be studio engineers. Now, all that costs money to do. And it was working with the prison governors that they figured out what the approach would be. Every prison governor had a budget for education. Every prison governor had a budget for work experience. But these were underspent because nobody wanted to do the programs they had. So they told the prison governors, look, what we can do is couch this and create it as an educational service. So the value proposition was to say, you've got a budget that's for education. You can pay that budget to us. We'll bring in more of your prisoners to be educated and turn the offering into an education one. We'll train people, and they became officially recognized as an education provider. So it was finding where the value proposition made sense to different stakeholders, and then using that approach to be able to build a sustainable business model that wasn't just justified on going around like another charity, collecting contributions to be able to help it, but actually it was an economically sustainable business model. And I think this kind of thinking, it takes the imagination of designers, as you said. It was like kind of Brian Chesky with the Airbnb, who were able to come up with a model that was like that. And I think this is something which, again, we need to make sure that we're very alert to as designers to think about. Well, look, I think it's time we should turn to some of the questions we've got. And I think, Emily, you've been looking at some of these. So let me introduce now Emily, and some of you will be familiar from previous masterclasses we've got. Emily has been thinking through, looking at all of those questions. She's going to pose them, I hope, mostly to Terry, and a few to me, perhaps, if I can add or make a little contribution. So, Emily, you lead off with the questions we've got.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you so much for the really, really interesting presentation, Terry. Some great examples there. We've had loads of questions in, so I'm just going to jump straight in. And I'll try and do these in a nice logical order because there's lots of very interesting kind of discussions I think we could kind of open up here. A really lovely question to start with from Samantha. As a designer, at what point do you start considering your business model?
I mean, right at the beginning, I think, it doesn't matter where you are in design, at what level you're operating, whether you're junior, you just started, you're middleweight, heavyweight, that's superfluous. I think it's Emily, it's a sort of it's like muscle memory. You got to start training it at some point. So it's never too early to start. And my sense is that those conversations will progress over time. And one of the really interesting things about that question is even some of the most senior designers, still take a lot of, and haven't practiced this, don't know how to have those conversations with an organization or with a partner. So starting as early as possible and saying, look, let's think about the product, let's develop it, but like, have we considered the other components of it? That matures beautifully over time, and then it just becomes second nature.
Brilliant. That leads me really nicely into a question from Ritma as well, which kind of slightly, I guess, goes off that. And this is based on one of their everyday experiences. When you go deeper into the business model and everything surrounding it, you often forget the starting point. So where you began and what the original design and idea might have been. And so Ritma's just asking you about what are your thoughts on that? How do you, you mentioned bringing this business model into it from the beginning. When you get to this point, sometimes do you ever lose the kind of the original energy, perhaps, or the motivation for the original product or idea or innovation?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a reality, and that's a potential danger. Always kind of for me, the starting point is, what problem are we trying to solve? And are we still true to solving that problem, or have we kind of evolved into delivering it a set of OKRs or KPIs that are really not inherently solving the problem anymore? They're just because we're in the job and that's what the job looks like, and that's a real danger because the problem space evolves all the time, and the job of the designer and the design team is not to continually kind of like reinvent the light bulb, so to speak, but it is certainly to evolve how we think about that particular product. And if it feels like we've lost track of it, it's absolutely appropriate to go back and through a sprint or through a hackathon or through some kind of process to say, look, let's rethink about, is this product or service still solving the same problem? Because a great business model is not necessarily going to shift the needle on a bad product.
Thanks, Terry. Nick, did you have anything else to add to that one?
Well, yeah, and I think the corollary of that as well is that sometimes a new business model can refresh a product and not only give it new life, but really distinguish it from others. You can often say that being the first mover in a new market, creating a new category, most of those often fail. People talk about first mover advantage. It's rarely the case. It's the first person who comes up with a business model that really resonates with the customer. Facebook were the first in the game. You could look at YouTube, again, not first in the game. Spotify, not first there. We've seen some great examples. But coming up with a business model, and by business model, that also means not just how you charge for it, but who charges for it and who pays for it. When I say who charges for it, what are the channels of distribution? Who's going to go out actually and sell it? Is it the company that does it? Is it going to be sold through third parties? I mean, it's like Apple decided it didn't want its fabulous phones being sold through the same place that was selling all those other phones. It wanted a place where people could see the value that their phones could create in their lives. That was the differentiator. And so getting the right business model, and if you're coming up with something that's a platform, and particularly a two-sided platform where people might be, let's take Uber as a classic one, or Airbnb, there are guests and there are hosts. Sorry, but, you've got both of those. And similarly, you've got drivers and you've got people who want to go somewhere as part of it. Making sure that the experience and the business model works for both sides of that is crucial. So again, it echoes this point. If you've got a rotten product, having a great business model isn't going to fix it. If you have a product that needs to be refreshed, differentiated, to make it stand out, sometimes the business model is the crucial element that enables that to happen. Go to the new channels of distribution, pricing it in a new way. I mean, all these things are part of the kind of creating that overall experience for all the different stakeholders, which I know as designers, we love to be able to do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. Terry, we've had another question. This is an anonymous question. At a large institution like Nedbank, how do you design a disruptive new business model without being cannibalized by the existing legacy or infrastructure?
Sure. I mean, that's a lot got to do with the difference between the kind of, again, the product and the business model. So typically, and Nick put it really well, is you get products that are in many ways commoditized. There are lots of versions of that in the market. And it may be just it may not be appropriate, it may not be possible to evolve the product any further, and therefore we kind of pivot to look at the business model. And I think, yeah, I hear this a lot from executives in banking and other industries, Emily. But what typically comes up is this like concern about cannibalizing. It's very simple. Either you're going to maybe cannibalize your own market share or shift that into a new model and see growth, or someone else is going to do it for you. So it does require a little bit of, typically at this particular point, leadership to make that leap and to say, we're going to take a bet. We're not certain. And it's okay to be uncertain, because it would be naive to express complete certainty. But we're uncertain, but we think this is the right direction to go. And that's the role of leadership, is to say, look, that road, that like the J. Cole quote, the good news is we've come a long way. The bad news is we're going the wrong way. Sometimes you just need to pivot and shift in another direction. And that's the role of leadership, to do that.
Wow, thank you, Terry. We've had so many questions in that I'm going to jump straight into the next one, if that's okay, Nick. Just
No,
somewhere
no,
I
no,
want to kind
please
of
do, please do.
get in. This one's about feedback loops and actually understanding when we know something's working. And Nigel asks, if we apply the kind of 5 growth rules effectively, what feedback loops should we expect to see to know that they're working, to know that the business plan is kind of effective?
Well, I mean, I think there's a very clear kind of waypoint in terms of sort of what are we ultimately trying to find when we're bringing a new product into the market or refreshing a product. We're looking for product market fit. We're looking to understand how we kind of relieve the pain, how we created a gain for a user, how we solve the problem. And I think importantly, when we hit product market fit, we are waiting for signs for the user to tell us that involuntarily. In other words, they're telling their friends, they're posting it on social. There's involuntary feedback coming back that has not been solicited from the organization that tells us this thing is heading in the right direction. So that's typically the kind of the first step. And then I think once we've kind of solved for product market fit, it's then we're off to the races. It's about scale, and that's where the business model kicks in. The business model accelerates that growth into the market. In some cases, like Nick said, it can refresh something that maybe just needed a fresh take in market. But often, the sort of feedback loops we're looking for are inherently baked into the idea of, have we found product market fit? And once we found product market fit, we can then consider scale and business model innovation. But those are usually the kind of like the differentiating stages between the two.
Can I just add on that one as well? Having a model that can scale is really crucial. I'm going to go back to the world of the PC 30 years ago. Michael Dell came along and figured out a model that would scale, where IBM and HP and the others, Toshiba, etc., just didn't have a scalable model for it. It scaled because he came up with the fact that you would pay in advance for the PC you were going to get. And that would generate cash in the business that would support and manage the sales to the corporate market. It was an elegant approach, selling direct, part of it, creating much greater margins inside the business and improving the cash flow as part of it. So this point, and again, that example that I gave of the kind of prisoner reoffending and in-house records, because there was budgets in every prison, you now had a replicable model to be able to do it. And as more prisoners didn't reoffend and then got jobs, many of them got jobs with in-house records, making it all work. So you scaled the resources and you had a scalable model. You could go prison by prison by prison. And before, went to 10,000 prisoners out of the 70, 80,000 in the UK. I've been through that program so far. I mean, it's getting the right business model that allows you to scale it and not just stay same size is really important.
This has actually brought me really nicely, thank you, Nick, on to a question that I had that I wanted to ask you both about. Terry, you mentioned adaptive scalability, and a lot of the work I do, we look at a lot of things to do with hyperlocal instances or locality, or kind of the effects of local cultural factors and what they have on perhaps business models. And so I wonder, do you have any examples of how organizations or businesses have kind of completely reshaped their business models to suit different locations or places, to suit the needs of the consumers or the audience or whoever is using this service or model?
Yeah.
In kind of locations, rather than just being kind of looking at entire cultures?
No, for sure. I mean, Emily, the cultural component of it can play a massive role in terms of how something is interpreted and therefore engaged with. the economics does that as well. I mean, I was working on a project in Kenya a number of years ago where it was a pharmacare company. They sold a product that was really loved by Kenyans, and they lost 90% market share in a really short period of time. They couldn't work out what it was. We worked out it was a series of economic shocks that had occurred that essentially said, the middle income homes in Kenya basically went, look, we love your product, we just can't afford it anymore, and they exited that sort of category. And what evolved really quickly was well, they still love the product, therefore we need to change the packaging size. And we went from, let's say, a 500 ml container down to blister packaging of 50 to 100 mLs. And sales actually grew in an economic downturn because they still kind of wanted access to the products. That was a sort of a packaging solution to the same problem. Often interesting on the kind of the cultural mix is arguably, and it's weird to say this, that some of the digital products do that really well. So, for example, if you were to open up your Uber Eats account, and I were to open up mine, they're served up not just in terms of the locations, but the way it's served up is now being kind of customized according to geography and cultural tastes. So that's evolving in the digital landscape, really. That's what they call it, hyper personalization. But that's evolving really quickly as well. So there's businesses are becoming better at it. I think it's around, is it viable to do it is often the big question. And if we do it, are we going to get a benefit from it? And if you can answer those questions, I think it's certainly something to explore.
Thanks, Terry. We've had a couple of questions that I'm going to kind of link up because I think they're quite related. So we've got one from an anonymous participant who says, as a young designer wanting to start a business, it's either thinking about design or thinking about sales and marketing, and I feel like my design gets lost in it. How do you suggest I go about it? And similarly, Kushpreet has asked, most business model discussions focus on product or tech startups. For a design-led service studio like mine, what structural shifts are necessary to move from a founder-dependent or freelance model to a scalable business model? So looking at this kind of design, these young designers or design studios, and how they can ensure that their the business model is really included in that process.
Sure. So here's the tough one to deal with. Certain things like design studios are only scalable to a certain point. And what I often find is that designers themselves, I think, will work through their studios and work through their models as far as they can. But they will see opportunity along the journey. And I'm being convinced, Emily, in my career thus far, that good designers with the right encouragement and the right support will make great innovators because they're empathetic, they see where the problem space exists, and ultimately they know how to design a solution to a certain extent to solve that problem and address it. Often, my input to designers starting out is at some point one needs to sort of think about not just designing for others, but also to design for yourself. And maybe the scale is not in adding more designers to a business, it's in adding engineers and product specialists and scientists, and then together they're solving a problem that is infinitely more scalable than just selling design itself. Because the world could always do with more designers. But the world definitely needs more designers in leadership roles, in startups and in enterprises, because we'll get better solutions as a consequence.
Can I just add a little bit
Yes,
to that one as well, which is as a design studio, understand you're a B2B business. You sell to businesses. And many of the companies you're selling to are also B2B. Now, if you're a B2B business, find out how your customer creates value for their customer and how it captures value from them. And your job as a designer is to go beyond the brief, show them how they can create more value for the customer, for their customers, and how they can capture more value. That's makes you a strategic partner to them. If you're working with an organization that is helping you deliver more value to your customers and helping you capture more, you can't live without them as part of it. And that means having empathy for the customer of your customer of your customer, figuring that out and how to create something that's really worthwhile for everyone in that value chain. Now, to me, empathy is the kind of superpower of designers. And we have a lot of empathy always for our ultimate end user of the product or service we're designing. But having empathy for the business model of the client that you're working with and helping them, that will put you in a really strong position. But to do that, you've really got to go under the skin of the organization. You've got to research them. You've got to use your research not just about your end users, but about the organization itself, and show them that you really care, that you really value what they do, and that you can advise them in that way. And bring your powers of imagination to be the person that can think more broadly, more widely, and in a more imaginative way than they ever could themselves. And you become indispensable as part of it. So, yeah, get close to this stuff.
Thank you, Nick. We've probably got time just for a couple more. So I wanted to ask, Justine asks, how do we experiment with new revenue or business models without disrupting core businesses?
I mean, this goes back to the prototyping process. So I think at the beginning, all these ideas around business model innovation are relatively embryonic, Emily. So, Justine, one of the things to do is to sort of take the prototypes for the business model and just go and talk to some trusted customers and whether it's focus groups, whether it's synthetic testing, whether it's preferably done in the real world with real people, and just to kind of connect with them around sort of maybe here's two or three options, which one kind of makes the most sense. And when they lock in on one, evolve that a little bit further, and then evolve that a little bit further. And then I think once it, on an evidence-based outcome, which would be saying going back to the business and saying, look, I've spoken to 100 customers, 80% of them think this is the right thing to do. Can we then look to maybe just commit to 5% of sales in the next year using this particular business model, and what changes need to be put in place to do so? I think one of the key things I've learned over the years is sort of spreadsheets are the love language of business. So ultimately, we have to kind of learn how to work with that as well and translate our ideas and translate the outcomes of a great sort of business model into sort of ones and zeros and into tangible numbers that can convince sort of a board or an executive team that this is the right way to go.
And
Thank
I'm
you,
just going
Terry.
to say as well, remember those business models evolve over time. Don't fall in love with the business model. Fall in love with its capacity to not just create value, but capture that value for the organization. Just as we always say, don't fall in love with your product. Fall in love with the challenge, the value that it creates in people's lives. That's what you want to fall in love with as part of it. So be ready to evolve, to change, to adapt, because every successful business is constantly evolving that business model, whether it's how they reach the market, which markets they're serving as part of it, what the revenue loop is that brings that revenue into it, and understand that all of those elements, you have to be agile, ready to change. And that's how you manage this.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Just got one last kind of comment, I guess. And this is from Maria. They say, thank you, Terry. Great insights. Do you have any reading, books, podcasts, or tools that you could recommend to keep us learning, especially focused for designers, perhaps, as we often or sometimes lack the wider vision in these kind of areas? So I wonder if you had any suggestions, or if you'd like to share them afterwards. Obviously, put you on the spot a bit in this last minute to
That's
go.
there's some good readings, Emily. What I'll do is I'll pull them and I'll share them out that we can just sort of send out to the audience. It's just like, it breaks down all the different kind of business models. I think Ash Maria as well is probably one of the sort of global thought leaders in this regard in terms of how to sort of crack new business models in existing organizations. So what I'll do is I'll play a couple of readings and I'll identify one or two podcasts as well that I think might be able to help, and I'll share them out today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Terry. I'll hand back over to you now. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for that. I mean, it's been absolutely super. You're a real master in this space, and that really comes through. I think every designer has a lot of commonality with entrepreneurs. Neither of us wanted a job like other people have. We both like as an approach to really make a difference, to make an impact as part of the way we work. And we're curious about the world and seeking new opportunities. So I think designers and entrepreneurs have a huge amount in common. And I think you demonstrated ably the point that, if you're thinking about being a designer in 2026, 2027, and over the next decades, then get close to understanding how you can not just create value for your client, but how you can help them capture it, or for the organization that you work within. Absolutely terrific stuff. So final words to everyone after thanking Terry for this is that if you are part of our academy, don't forget that session 5 is coming up on March the 3rd. And it's going to be an absolutely terrific session that day. We've got Harvard Business School with Douglas coming in. He is a fantastic speaker in the world of AI and the ethics of AI. And we have from UNESCO, Valtencia Mendez. And Valtencia is the E. He's the Chief of Education. The E in UNESCO is going to be joining us as well on this topic about the role of AI and what we need to be thinking about as designers to ensure that not only do we exploit it effectively, we exploit it ethically too. So that's on March the 3rd. So we'll look forward to seeing many of you on that date. So Terry, thanks again for being part of this, to Emily for facilitating our questions so ably, and all of our colleagues at the Royal College of Art and Design for Good, who have not been visible on your screen, but have been pulling all the strings to make this work so smoothly behind the scenes. So thank you to everyone, and look out for the next masterclass that's coming up, and get ready on 3rd of March for those of you who are part of the Academy to come to an absolutely brilliant session. Thank you, everyone.